I had been sitting at my desk in the quiet hum of the finance floor, absorbed in the numbers on my screen, when it hit me hard enough to make me grip the edge of my desk. It was the sort of pain that wouldn't let you ignore it, that made your mind flash warnings insisting you take action now. Leaving the office in the middle of the day was unusual for me, but I could already tell I wouldn't get anything else done. My mind went through the possibilities, none of them making sense. I didn't have time to be sick, and Jessica, my wife, had a packed schedule this month, filled with photo shoots, influencer deals, and her charity events. She was the brand manager for her own social media empire, juggling product placements and thousands of followers, and had recently taken on new partnerships with some boutique health companies. Between her work and mine, it was a balancing act to find time together, and I certainly didn't want to add any medical crises to our already stretched schedule. The drive to the clinic felt like a fever dream. I kept gripping the steering wheel, hoping the pain would ease by the time I arrived. By the time I sat down in the waiting room, clutching a clipboard of paperwork I'd filled out a dozen times before, I just wanted answers. Dr. Patel, a quiet, serious man in his 50s, had been my doctor for years. He'd been there through the birth of our daughter, Harper, and had even come to a few of Jessica's public events when she was just getting her footing as a local influencer. He was reliable, a steady figure through many milestones, and I trusted him implicitly. After what seemed like forever in that sterile exam room, he finally re-entered, his expression tight, holding a thin manila folder. He didn't sit, but instead leaned slightly against the counter, his gaze level. "Michael," he started carefully, "I need to ask you some difficult questions. They're very personal, and I want you to know this is just protocol." He held up a hand, as if to ward off any response. "Please bear with me." I sat up straighter, the anxiety in my chest tightening. "Of course. Go ahead." He looked down at his notes for a moment, flipping a few pages, then asked, "When was the last time you were sexually active?" The question, clinical as it was, made me bristle. "I don't understand, Michael," he interrupted, his voice low and cautious. "The reason I ask is because we ran a few tests to understand the source of your pain. It appears that you've contracted a sexually transmitted infection." My mind stopped, as if frozen, unable to move forward or backward, anchored in disbelief. That's not possible," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. I've only been with my wife. I've never." "I understand," he replied, and there was a tone of genuine sympathy in his voice that somehow made it worse. He continued, "But this test is definitive. The infection is present, and it's one that typically doesn't just appear without sexual contact." The room around me seemed to close in. It was as if every object, the cabinets, the sink, the medical charts on the wall, all sharpened into hyperfocus, while my thoughts blurred and muddied. No, I mean Jessica. She wouldn't. This has to be a mistake." Dr. Patel's expression softened, but he didn't back down. "I wish I could tell you otherwise, Michael, but this is not something that typically comes from a misdiagnosis. Now, I understand this is hard to process. Given the nature of this particular infection, we are required to notify the health department, who will in turn contact any known partners." I could barely process his words, but the last part cut through. "Contact partners? You're saying that this will become public?" My voice came out strained, incredulous. He gave a small, almost apologetic nod. "Yes, given recent legislation here in the county, STDs of this kind must be tracked and reported. Your wife will need to disclose any other potential contacts as part of the procedure. An investigator may even follow up if more names arise." My stomach twisted at the thought. This wasn't just between Jessica and me. It was now a record, an official matter, something that would exist outside our walls, something that could easily become a scandal. Jessica, with her public image, her carefully cultivated persona, her followers and sponsors, it felt surreal. This couldn't be happening. I found myself grasping for explanations that sounded ridiculous the moment I thought them. Maybe she got it some other way. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But no matter how I twisted the possibilities, the hard truth echoed back at me. Jessica had been with someone else. And now I was carrying the proof. Dr. Patel watched me, waiting, as if giving me the space to grapple with the implications. I felt the words struggling to leave my mouth, a final, Hesitant question I didn't want to ask but had to. Well, what do I do now? His expression softened further, his voice measured but gentle. You'll need to speak with her, Michael. She'll need to come in for her own treatment, and she'll need to provide a complete list of any other contacts. It's essential to prevent further spread, and she needs to be treated as soon as possible. The phrase other contacts sounded clinical, detached, but it stung, twisting the pain in my chest even tighter. I sat there, feeling exposed and disoriented, like I was no longer tethered to anything familiar. I nodded absently, hardly knowing what I was agreeing to. I felt numb, barely able to look Dr. Patel in the eye. Thank you for telling me, I murmured, words empty and mechanical. I left the clinic in a daze, stepping out into the blinding afternoon light of San Antonio, my head spinning with too many questions and too few answers. As I drove home, 1,000 fractured thoughts rushed through my mind. Images of Jessica, moments in our marriage that seemed innocent at the time, but now felt shadowed with doubt. Who was she with? How many times? Did I know him? Or were there more? The drive home felt endless. Every stoplight, every moment waiting behind a car inching along, only twisted the anger inside me tighter. I didn't know what I would say to Jessica, but the words felt irrelevant. I just needed her to answer, to make sense of the senselessness of it all. I wanted a confession, a moment where she couldn't hide behind carefully curated photos or perfectly worded social media posts. Just the truth. As I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed, stark and silent against the afternoon sky, framed by the meticulously maintained shrubs Jessica had insisted on for our family aesthetic. I killed the engine, watching the front door as if expecting it to open, half expecting her to be standing there, waiting with an excuse. Inside, the house was eerily still. I dropped my keys on the entryway table, the clink echoing in the silence. The sight of our living room, perfectly arranged throw pillows, vases, and photos lined up in straight rows, only sharpened my irritation. The place felt staged, like some facade of happiness instead of an actual home. I sank into the leather armchair by the window, the one I'd picked years ago but barely sat in anymore. The reality of our 12 years together began to unravel, memories surfacing like fragments of broken glass. I recalled the late-night phone calls she took in hushed tones, the weekend networking trips, her excuses to be away while I stayed with our daughter, Harper. I never questioned her because I'd always trusted her. Time dragged as I waited, watching the light fade outside, casting shadows across the room. My phone vibrated, the name on the screen, Jessica, glowing coldly in the dim room. She was sending a text, probably her usual running late excuse. I ignored it, leaning back, fingers tapping against the armrest, wondering just how much longer I'd wait. At last, I heard her car pull into the driveway. Another sound, a laugh, male and loud, floated through the quiet street as Jessica and another voice approached. My pulse quickened, and I tensed, my grip tightening on the armrest. A moment later, the front door opened, and Jessica's laugh carried into the entryway, carefree and careless. I swear, Daniel, you are terrible, she said, her voice bright. That's why you keep me around. The man, Daniel apparently, responded with a laugh. As they entered, her laughter faltered when her eyes landed on me. Her hand flew up to her mouth, eyes wide, her face draining of color. Daniel, a tall, smug-looking man with an expensive haircut and a flashy suit, looked at me, smirking as if I were the one intruding. Michael, what are you doing here? Jessica's voice quivered slightly, her eyes darting between me and Daniel, panic flashing in them. She reached for the strap of her purse, fingers fiddling with it nervously. I stood up, feeling the heat rise in my chest. Funny, I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. I was just about to ask you the same thing. Daniel, oblivious or just plain arrogant, stepped forward, that smirk plastered across his face. Hey, man, nice place you've got here. Jessica's told me all about it. I ignored him, my gaze fixed on Jessica, who shifted uneasily, her face twisted with guilt. Do you mind explaining, Jessica? I asked, voice low, restrained. Or should I be asking your friend here? Jessica looked down, her hands fidgeting, but Daniel chuckled, shrugging. Relax, Mom. You don't have to get all worked up. This sort of thing happens, right? He gave a condescending wink, as if this were some common, forgivable mistake. That was it. I felt something snap, a raw anger surging up from somewhere deep and unfamiliar. Before I knew what I was doing, I crossed the room in a few quick strides, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him toward the door. His smug expression vanished as he stumbled back, his hands shooting up defensively. Get out, I snarled, barely recognizing the voice coming out of my own mouth. And don't think for a second I'll let this slide. Jessica gasped, stepping between us, hands outstretched. Michael, please. Stop. You don't understand. Don't understand? I cut her off, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. You bring this stranger into our home, and I don't understand? Daniel straightened himself, smoothing his collar with exaggerated slowness, that irritating smirk creeping back onto his face. You touch me again, he said, voice low and smug, and I'll have you charged. Assault and battery. You want to add that to your list of problems? His words hung in the air like a dark cloud, the legal threat slicing through my rage just enough to bring me back to my senses. I took a step back, fists clenched, my pulse pounding. Jessica grabbed my arm, her voice breaking. Please, Michael. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Just let me explain. Explain? I echoed, my voice dripping with disgust. Explain how you ended up in bed with this clown? Jessica looked down, her face red, tears beginning to fill her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened. I didn't think it would go this far. Daniel, watching this scene unfold like it was his own private drama, finally let out a scoff. You really should have been around more, Michael, he muttered, half under his breath. Then maybe you wouldn't be so surprised. I turned on him, ready to push him out of the house myself, but he raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, I'll go, he said, backing away. But don't say I didn't warn you, buddy. He threw a last glance at Jessica before walking out, not a trace of remorse on his face as he strolled to his car. The door closed behind him, leaving me and Jessica alone in a suffocating silence. She looked at me, her face streaked with tears, hands clasped in front of her as if begging for forgiveness. Michael, she whispered, voice cracking. I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, incredulous. Jessica, you brought him into our house, into our lives. Don't pretend this was some accident. Her face contorted, her shoulders shaking as she began to cry. I didn't know what else to do. I felt so lost. I thought. You thought what? I demanded, each word sharper than the last. That you could just sneak around, throw it all away, and then come back home and pretend like nothing was wrong? She covered her face, sobbing, but I was beyond caring. Her apologies, her tears, they meant nothing to me now, mere fragments of the carefully crafted persona she'd spent years building, the one I'd so foolishly trusted. I stepped back, my voice cold. You'll need to go see Dr. Patel. Get treated. And while you're there, I continued, my voice hard, you can give him the list of every other man you've been with. Jessica froze, looking up at me, her face drained of color. Michael, please don't. No, I snapped. You owe me that much, don't you think? Or are you just going to keep lying? She hesitated, her face a mixture of horror and shame. Finally, she nodded, barely meeting my eyes. She opened her mouth, but whatever word she had died in her throat. I watched her crumble, realizing, perhaps for the first time, just how much damage she had done. The silence stretched on as she slowly backed away, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to look at me as she shuffled into the hallway. I stood in the empty living room, numb and hollow, the remnants of our marriage scattered around me like ashes. After Jessica and Daniel left, the house felt strangely empty, as if their presence had hollowed out something essential. I wandered through each room, feeling like a stranger in my own home, taking in every detail as if I were seeing it all for the first time. The living room, with its carefully arranged bookshelves and family photos on the walls, looked like a stage set now, something meticulously put together to hide the rot underneath. It was an image of a life I thought we were living, now twisted and hollow. My gaze fell on the hallway that led to the guest bedroom, the very space Jessica had insisted on turning into her home office. She'd once said it was for privacy, while she recorded her social media videos, making it sound like a necessity. "It's so noisy in the main bedroom with Harper around," she'd said, half joking. Now, thinking back on it, the excuses seemed absurdly transparent, and I felt foolish for ever accepting them. I stepped into the guest room, a room I had hardly entered before, its light, airy decor feeling almost foreign. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, illuminating the perfectly arranged furniture. A neat little desk with her laptop, a vanity mirror lined with soft lights, an elegant chaise by the window. Everything was so carefully crafted, everything in its place. I'd never questioned the need for it. I'd never thought to look closer. In that silence, every memory felt tainted, each one revealing itself as a clue I should have seen but didn't. The late nights, the extended business trips, the messages she answered away from my line of sight. She had built an entire world in this very room, and I had unwittingly allowed it. The thought of her lover or lovers, who knew how many, being in that same space made my stomach turn. The images, unwanted and vile, flashed in my mind. The room filled with whispered secrets, hands touching, laughter, and the subtle perfume she wore every day. I gripped the edge of her desk, knuckles white, nausea rolling over me. Just then, I heard the sound of tires on gravel outside. I turned, moving toward the front door and glancing out the window. It was Riley, coming home earlier than usual. She stepped out of the car with her backpack slung over one shoulder, glancing up at the house. Her face looked relaxed, oblivious to the fracture that had split her family just hours ago. I took a breath, steeling myself, as she came through the door. "Hey, Dad," she greeted me with a smile, pausing as she took in my expression. "Are you all right?" I looked at her, the question heavy in her eyes, and suddenly the truth felt too close to hide. She had the same curious gaze Jessica once had when we first met, a gaze that held so much trust. But hiding this from her would be another lie, one I couldn't afford to carry. I knew the truth would hurt her, but I couldn't shield her from it forever. "Riley, come sit with me," I said, my voice barely holding steady. Her smile faded. Worry etched across her face as she dropped her backpack and sat on the couch. "What's wrong, Dad?" she asked softly, studying me. I took a deep breath, unable to meet her eyes at first. "Riley, there's something you should know. I wasn't sure how, or if, I'd ever tell you, but your mother, she hasn't been honest with us. She's betrayed me." For a moment, Riley's face was blank, the words hanging in the air as if she were processing a foreign language. And then, as if realizing the weight behind each word, her expression shifted, her lips parting slightly, her eyes wide. "Mom cheated on you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, feeling the impact of that single word as it lingered between us. Her hand flew to her mouth, her face paling. She seemed caught between disbelief and horror, glancing away, as though searching for something to anchor herself. Riley swallowed hard, and when she looked back at me, there was something else in her gaze, a shadow, something she hadn't yet voiced. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down, fingers clutching the edge of her shirt as she spoke. I've seen her with other men. Twice, actually. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to break our family apart." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't speak, every question in my mind suddenly making perfect, painful sense. She had known. My daughter had known, and she had carried that weight alone, hiding it to protect the illusion of our family. I forced myself to steady my voice. "Riley, when did you see this? What exactly did you see?" She swallowed, her gaze dropping. "The first time was a few months ago. I came home early from school because of that power outage. Remember? I didn't think anyone was here, but I heard Mom laughing from the guest room. I thought she was just working on one of her videos, but when I opened the door, there was this man with her. He looked surprised to see me, and she told me it was just a business meeting. I didn't believe her, but I didn't know what to say. She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. I didn't want to hurt you. I felt the ground slipping beneath me, everything unraveling. Every word she said confirming my worst fears. And the second time? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It was about a month ago. I was at a friend's house, but I forgot my charger and came back to get it. Her car was parked outside, and there was another car too, a black SUV. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. I just sat outside for a while, and then I left. I didn't know how to tell you, Dad. I didn't want to be the one to break your heart. I reached out, pulling her into an embrace, feeling the weight of her silent suffering, and my own shame for not realizing sooner. She'd carried this alone, all in a misguided attempt to keep our family intact, to shield me from pain. In that moment, I understood the depth of her love, and it only deepened my grief. Riley, you did nothing wrong. I murmured, holding her close. None of this is your fault. I should have seen it. I should have known. But thank you for telling me. You're braver than you know. She pulled back, looking up at me with a haunted expression. Dad, what are you going to do? I felt the question echo through me, heavy and unresolved. What was I going to do? Jessica had destroyed the trust between us, shattered our lives with a selfishness I couldn't have imagined. The house around us, our so-called home, felt like an elaborate lie, a charade I was no longer willing to play along with. I don't know yet, I replied honestly, my voice weary. But whatever happens, we're going to get through this. Just you, me, and Harper. We're a family, and we'll stay one, no matter what she's done. Riley nodded, wiping away a stray tear, her face still full of pain but stronger somehow, as though sharing this secret had lifted some of the weight from her. She looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the family photos on the wall, pictures that now seemed like relics from another life, frozen moments from a reality that no longer existed. Evening settled over the house, casting long shadows across the kitchen as Riley, Sam, and I sat around the table, plates untouched. It was a quiet we weren't used to, a tense, brittle kind of silence that seemed to wrap around us all, cutting through any attempt at normalcy. Sam had been unusually quiet, looking back and forth between me and Riley, sensing the unease but not fully understanding its depths. Riley sat across from me, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the doorway as if waiting, steeling herself. She had insisted on staying up with me after we talked, a grim determination in her eyes that told me she wasn't willing to let this go. We hadn't said much. What could we say? But I could see in her that fierce loyalty and love she had always shown our family, now interwoven with the anger she'd barely held back earlier. Finally, I heard the familiar sound of Jessica's car pulling up, the engine idling for a moment before it cut off. Riley tensed, her fingers digging into her arms. Across from her, Sam looked up, his eyes darting toward me, a question in them that I couldn't bring myself to answer. A few moments later, the front door opened, and Jessica's footsteps echoed down the hall. I could tell she was trying to come in quietly, perhaps thinking she'd slip back into the routine without having to face the tension she'd left behind. But as she entered the kitchen, her eyes landed on us, and the false smile she wore faded as she took in the three of us sitting there, waiting. Hey, she started, trying for casual, her voice wavering as she glanced at each of us. Didn't expect everyone to be up. Riley's stare was piercing, cold, her lips pressed in a hard line. Sam, sensing the tension, shifted uncomfortably but didn't look away. Jessica's smile faded completely as she took a step closer, hands twisting nervously at her sides. I thought you'd be in bed by now, she said, her voice softer, as if trying to placate us. Riley's voice broke the silence, sharp and unwavering. How could you, she said, each word heavy and raw. How could you do this to us? Jessica blinked, taken aback, her mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came. She looked from Riley to me, her face clouded with confusion and guilt, clearly unprepared for this. Riley, she began, a false warmth in her tone as she took a step toward her. You don't understand, sweetheart. It's not as simple as it seems. Riley's eyes narrowed, and she stood, backing away, her voice rising with a strength that surprised even me. "Don't call me that. Don't try to act like nothing happened. I'm not a kid, Mom. I saw you twice. I saw you with other men." Jessica froze, her expression changing in an instant, her face paling as Riley's words landed. She glanced over at me, a flicker of desperation in her eyes, as if hoping I'd step in, but I stayed silent, letting Riley speak. It wasn't supposed to be like this," Jessica stammered, her voice faltering. "Riley, it was a mistake. Something I did because I don't know. I wasn't myself." "Not yourself?" Riley scoffed, her voice dripping with anger. "Mom, don't lie. I know it wasn't just one man. I know there were others. Don't try to make this sound like some kind of accident." Jessica took a shaky breath, reaching out a hand toward her, but Riley pulled back, a look of disgust on her face. "Do you know what you've done to us?" Riley continued, her voice cracking. "You've ruined everything. You're a stranger to me now. You're nothing like the person I thought you were." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, her hand dropping as she took a step back, visibly stunned. "Riley, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Riley spat, her voice trembling with rage. She clenched her fists, taking a step forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "You tore our family apart for what? For a bunch of random men who didn't care about you? How could you be so selfish?" Jessica flinched, as if struck, the words hitting her with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could get a word out, Riley raised her hand and, in a single fluid motion, slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the kitchen, a sharp, shocking crack that seemed to freeze everything in place. Jessica staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, her expression one of stunned disbelief as she looked at her daughter, her eyes wide with shock. "Riley," she whispered, voice breaking, but she was met with an unyielding glare. "Don't try to explain," Riley said, her voice ice-cold, filled with a raw, unforgiving rage. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You've become a stranger, and I don't even want to know you anymore." Jessica's gaze shifted to Sam, who had been sitting in silence, watching everything unfold with a pained expression. He looked away, his small shoulders slumped, the hurt written clearly on his face as he spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "You ruined us," he said softly, the weight of his words heavy in the air. Jessica looked from Riley to Sam, her face crumpling as she took in their rejection, the realization settling over her that the family she once took for granted had slipped through her fingers. Her shoulders shook, her hand falling limply to her side as she took a step back, her face now streaked with silent tears. She looked over at me, eyes pleading, but I simply held her gaze unmoved. Without another word, Jessica turned and stumbled out of the kitchen, retreating down the hallway. We listened as her footsteps echoed through the house, each step a stark reminder of the brokenness she had left behind. She disappeared into the guest room, the door closing with a soft, final click. In the silence that followed, Riley's anger softened, and she slumped back in her chair, exhaustion etched across her face. Sam looked down, his face shadowed with confusion and sadness, too young to fully understand but old enough to feel the weight of what had just happened. I placed a hand on each of their shoulders, pulling them close, the three of us sitting together, bound by a shared pain that none of us had asked for. The days following Jessica's confrontation with Riley and Sam passed in tense silence, the house heavy with an unspoken acknowledgement that things could never go back to how they were. Jessica had moved into the guest bedroom as I'd told her to, but every so often, I'd catch her lingering in the hallway, her eyes searching mine, as if hoping for some hint of forgiveness or a crack in the wall that separated us. When she tried to broach the idea of working things out, of somehow salvaging what she'd destroyed, I made it clear to her, the marriage was over. Whatever threads held us together had frayed beyond repair. But, it seemed, Jessica had other ideas about what boundaries meant. Late one night, after a long day at the office, I left work early, hoping to surprise Riley and Sam with some takeout from their favorite place. As I pulled up to the house, The usual glow from the living room lights was absent, the house cast in darkness except for a single dim light from the guest bedroom window. My heart sank, a bad feeling gnawing at me as I parked the car. I didn't even make it to the door before I saw Riley and Sam standing outside, huddled together on the front steps, Sam looking pale and uncomfortable while Riley's face was a hard mask of anger. She glanced up as I approached, the rage in her eyes barely contained. "Dad," she said in a tight whisper, "we couldn't stay inside. She's in there with some guy. In the guest room." A cold fury ran through me, sharper than anything I'd felt before. My fists clenched involuntarily, my pulse pounding in my ears. I knelt down, looking them both in the eyes, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wait here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but I could see the relief in Riley's eyes and the nervous gratitude in Sam's. They nodded, moving to sit on the porch swing as I stepped inside. The hallway leading to the guest room felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of what I was about to do. Muffled voices drifted through the door, Jessica's laugh, light and familiar, but tainted now, twisted with a tone I didn't recognize. And then, another voice, a man's, low and smug. I recognized it instantly. Travis, a married co-worker of hers, the type of man who wore his arrogance as casually as his tailored suits. I didn't bother knocking. My hand found the door handle, and I threw it open, the door slamming back against the wall as I stepped into the room. Jessica and Travis sprang apart, their faces frozen in shock. Travis, sprawled on the bed in nothing but his boxer shorts, scrambled upright, his expression twisting from surprise to irritation as he took in the sight of me. Jessica's face drained of color, her hand flying to her mouth as if she could somehow hide her shame. "Michael," she gasped, her voice shaking. This isn't... I can explain." "Explain?" I cut her off, my voice low and deadly. "Don't bother. I don't need your excuses." Travis, finally regaining some semblance of composure, let out a snort, pushing himself off the bed and grabbing his shirt from the chair nearby. He gave me a dismissive look, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience, an obstacle in his path. "Listen, man," he started, his tone laced with arrogance. "There's no need to overreact. These things happen. The audacity of it, of him standing there in my home, shrugging off the wreckage of my family like it was nothing more than a casual inconvenience, made my blood boil. Without thinking, I crossed the room in 2 steps, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him hard against the wall. "Get out!" I hissed, my voice cold and venomous. "You don't belong here." Travis's eyes widened, his bravado faltering for a brief second before he recovered, attempting a sneer as he straightened himself, his eyes narrowing. "Do that again, and you'll regret it," he spat. "I have connections, Michael. You lay a finger on me, and I'll make sure you're the one facing charges." For a moment, I considered ignoring his threat, letting the anger take over, but the sight of his smug, entitled face twisted something inside me that went beyond rage. It was contempt, a deep, visceral disgust that made him feel like something lower than the dirt on my shoes. I released him, taking a step back, watching as he quickly pulled on his shirt and stumbled into his shoes, clearly unsettled now, but trying to hide it. Jessica, meanwhile, sat on the edge of the bed, watching me with tear-filled eyes, the shame and fear in her expression painfully transparent. Travis sneered, giving me a last, pointed look as he adjusted his collar. "I'll let this slide," he muttered, his tone icy. "But remember, Michael, you have no right to touch me. Watch yourself." I held his gaze, unflinching, my silence more damning than anything I could have said. He seemed to realize it too, finally turning and heading for the door, the smirk wiped clean from his face. As he disappeared down the hall, I turned my attention back to Jessica. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, trembling as she tried to form words. "Michael, I didn't mean for it to be like this. Please, I know I made a mistake, but I can fix this. I didn't know how else to." "You didn't know how?" I interrupted, my voice cold, hollow. "So you thought bringing a married man into our home, into our lives, was the answer? Do you even realize what you've done?" She choked back a sob, reaching out to me, but I stepped back, disgusted. "This is it, Jessica," I said firmly, the finality of the words ringing in the air. "Tonight is your last night in this house. I want you gone." Her hand fell to her side, her face crumpling as she took in the reality of what I'd said. "Michael, please," she whispered, her voice broken, but the sympathy I'd once felt for her was gone, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. "I don't want to hear it," I replied, barely recognizing my own voice. "You've made your choices, Jessica. Now you live with them." The morning dawned crisp and clear, the early light casting long shadows across the driveway as I stood by the door, waiting for Jessica. I'd told her earlier, bluntly and without hesitation, that she had 30 minutes to pack her things and leave the house. There were no more conversations to be had, no more apologies I was willing to hear. I wanted her gone, her presence erased from the life she had torn apart. The kids, Riley, Sam, and our youngest, Mason, stood on the porch with me, watching as the minutes ticked by. Riley's face was set, determined, while Sam looked away, his expression unreadable, a mixture of anger and confusion. Mason, still too young to grasp the full scope of what had happened, clutched Riley's hand tightly, sensing the tension but unsure of its meaning. Finally, Jessica appeared in the doorway, dragging her suitcase behind her, her shoulders hunched, her face streaked with what might have been genuine sorrow or just the bitter taste of consequence. She paused, glancing at the children, as if hoping for some sign of forgiveness, but their faces were stone, offering her nothing. "Kids," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes filled with a desperate, pleading look. She took a step forward, holding out a trembling hand. "Please, I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I still love you all. I need you to understand that." Riley's jaw tightened, her gaze unwavering. "Love us," she repeated, her voice cold, each word cutting like a blade. "You're only saying that because you got caught. You didn't care about us when you were sneaking around with those men, did you?" Jessica flinched, her hand dropping as she glanced away, unable to meet Riley's stare. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she stammered. I thought I could keep things separate. I never wanted to hurt you." "Stop lying," Riley snapped, her voice cracking with the anger she'd held back for too long. She took a step forward, pulling Mason closer, her expression hard. "You were only thinking about yourself. You tore this family apart because of your selfishness, and you don't get to stand here now and act like you care." Jessica looked to Sam, searching his face for some hint of forgiveness, but he avoided her gaze, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He said nothing, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Realizing she'd find no solace with Sam, Jessica's gaze fell back on Riley, her voice breaking as she tried once more, desperation clear in her eyes. "Riley, please give me a chance to make this right. I know I was wrong, I know that, but I want to fix things. I want to be here for you, for all of you." Riley's expression didn't change. She took a deep breath, then spoke, her words heavy with finality. "You're not welcome here, Mom. Not anymore. You gave that up when you chose them over us." Jessica's face crumpled, a sob escaping her lips as she took a stumbling step back, her gaze darting between her children as if searching for a crack in their wall of rejection. "I love you," she whispered, voice choked with tears. "I love all of you, no matter what you think of me." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, in a gesture that seemed to drain the last of the warmth from the morning, Riley reached into her pocket, pulling out a handful of torn photographs. Memories that had once hung on our walls, pieces of the life we'd built together. Without a word, she flung them onto the ground at Jessica's feet, the fragments scattering across the concrete like dead leaves. Jessica's eyes widened as she looked down, realizing what Riley had done. Pictures of birthdays, holidays, vacations, a life that was now beyond repair. Each piece lay before her, a painful symbol of the family she had shattered. She stared at them, her face crumpling, finally understanding the depth of her children's hurt. "Goodbye, Mom," Riley said quietly, her voice cold and resolute. She pulled Sam and Mason close, turning away from Jessica, her gaze fixed firmly on the door, unwilling to look back. Jessica stumbled, her hand covering her mouth as the weight of it all crashed down on her. She looked at me, eyes red and desperate, but I offered no comfort. There was nothing left to say. I simply turned and followed my children inside, the door closing with a quiet, final click, cutting off the sight of her once and for all. Through the window, I watched as she stood there, staring down at the torn photographs, her body hunched, defeated, the enormity of her actions finally sinking in. And then, slowly, she bent down, gathered her suitcase, and walked away, the fragments of our family left scattered behind her as she disappeared down the driveway. Inside, the house felt different. The air was lighter, as if a shadow had lifted, even as the weight of what we had lost lingered. I looked at Riley, Sam, and Mason, the three of them standing together, bound by the unbreakable bond that Jessica had tried and failed to sever. My new apartment was modest, nothing like the home I'd shared with Jessica, but it was peaceful. Its quiet simplicity had a comfort all its own, a kind of sanctuary where the kids and I could start fresh. The space was ours to rebuild, room by room, little by little. And for the first time, I felt the absence of Jessica's shadow, a relief I hadn't anticipated. Moving in had been a slow but satisfying process. The kids helped unpack, bringing some of the good memories with us. Photos of family trips, Riley's art projects, a handful of souvenirs Sam insisted on from our vacations, and Mason's stuffed animals, which he dutifully lined up along the windowsill, as if guarding our new world. Piece by piece, we put our lives back together, finding new places for our memories. One evening, after we'd been in the apartment for a few weeks, I planned a small dinner. I'd invited Sophie, someone I'd met through a mutual friend. She was warm and genuine, and I'd found myself looking forward to her company in ways I hadn't expected. We'd met for coffee a couple of times, each conversation feeling like a new layer of hope. The kids were nervous about meeting her, especially Riley, who had taken on a protective role since everything had unfolded. I understood their hesitancy. They'd been through too much upheaval to trust anyone easily, and I couldn't blame them. But I also knew it was time for them to see that life had more to offer than just painful memories. As Sophie arrived, I could sense Riley's watchful eyes on her, assessing her every move. Sophie greeted her with a genuine warmth that slowly disarmed the guarded look in Riley's eyes. She chatted with Sam about his favorite video games and even knelt down to speak to Mason, who shyly showed her his favorite stuffed bear. Within minutes, the apartment was filled with a quiet laughter I hadn't heard in too long. It was a reminder that healing could come in small, unexpected ways. Over dinner, we talked about everything and nothing at once. School, our favorite movies, the funny mishaps I'd had trying to cook in a kitchen half the size of the one we'd left behind. Sophie shared stories from her own childhood, delighting Mason with tales of her mischievous pet dog and the trouble they used to get into. She had a way of making everyone feel seen, heard. I caught Riley glancing at her with a hesitant smile, as if testing the idea of letting someone new into our lives. After dessert, Sophie helped me clear the table, and as we worked side by side, a calm settled over me. I could feel the trust growing slowly, almost imperceptibly. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the pieces were starting to fit back together. Once the kids had gone off to bed, Sophie and I sat together on the balcony, the city lights stretching out beneath us. I told her about the past, about everything Jessica's choices had left me to piece back together. Sophie listened without interruption, her gaze steady, never flinching from the truth of what I'd endured. When I finished, she placed a gentle hand on mine. "You've been through so much, Michael," she said softly. "But look at what you've built with them. You've shown your kids that they deserve better, and you're giving them that every day." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in, grounding me in this new reality. I used to think our family was unbreakable. I admitted, my voice quiet. But maybe this is a chance to build something even stronger. Just different. She smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that seemed to dissolve the last remnants of doubt. "Exactly," she whispered, "and you don't have to do it alone." In that moment, I knew things had truly changed. There was still a part of me that would always carry the memory of what had happened, but it no longer defined me, no longer held me hostage to the past. Jessica's choices were hers alone, and the consequences, her tarnished reputation, the whispering circles she'd once thrived in, were her own to bear. Word had spread, and the fallout from her actions had isolated her in ways I'd never intended but couldn't prevent. The friends she'd once courted with meticulous charm had slipped away, unwilling to associate with the woman who had burned every bridge. We never spoke of her again, the kids and I. For them, she had become a memory, a cautionary tale, a ghost that had faded into the background of our lives. The final image of her on that driveway was all the closure we'd needed, a reminder that she was part of a past we'd outgrown. We were moving forward, as Sophie and I sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the kids laughing faintly from their rooms. I realized we were free to create something new, untethered from what had been. And in that freedom, there was hope, a quiet, resilient hope that promised a life built on trust, honesty, and the strength we had found in each other.